Began last week the seventh parak, Yoma Kippurim. I'm sorry, the eighth parak, Yoma Kippurim. And the Gemara, if you recall, just to review, was Medaik in the language of the Mishnah. The Mishnah says Yoma Kippurim Asur, Bachila, Shasia, Rechitza, etc., implying that there's no Isur Kares, there's only an Isur. And the Gemara tried to explain that the reason why the Brisa postulates that you don't get kares for eating on Yom Kippur is because the scenario is Chatzi Shir. Now the Gemara says that Chatzi Shir is awesome in a Torah according to one Mandiyomar. And that Mandiyomar we'll see is none other than Rabbi Yochanan. And that fits in very well, that our Mishnah, when it speaks about an Isur Doraisa, it's referring to a Chatzi Shir. However, what about according to Reish Lakish? His opinion is that Chatzi Shir is mutam in Torah. How will we explain the language of Asur? And the Gemara then suggests that even though Reish Lakish denies Chatzi Shir min Torah as an Isur, nevertheless, he agrees that Chatzi Shir is Asur mid'Rabbanan. And as a result, the Mishnah says Asur, meaning it's Asur mid'Rabbanan. So Rabbi Yochanan is going to read the Mishnah as Asur mid'Oraisa because he holds that Chatzi Shir is Asur min Torah. Reish Lakish is going to read the Mishnah Asur mid'Rabbanan because he holds that Chatzi Shir is mutar min Torah, but it's Asur mid'Rabbanan. And what we began last week was a proof that the Gemara tries to adduce from a Mishnah in Masechet Shavuos to prove that according to Reish Lakish, Chatzi Shir is not even Asur mid'Rabbanan. How do we see this? The Gemara says, "Ihachi lo nechayev alei karban shvua." Now, what's the case of karban shvua? So, if we take a look here, this is where we want to start for tonight. On the bottom of Daf Ayin Gimel Amid Beis, and we're going to look at the last 5 lines in the Gemara on Daf Ayin Gimel Amid Beis. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 lines going up from the bottom. And towards the end of that line, it says Aloma Tnan. And we're going to quote, as we said earlier, a Mishnah in Masechet Shavuos. And the Mishnah says the following. And we're going to try to prove, based on this Mishnah, that there's not even going to be an Isur D'Rabbanan in the case of Chatzi Shir, according to Reish Lakish. Shvua shelo ochal, a man takes a shvua that he won't eat today. V'ochal nevelos utreifos shkotzin v'ramosim. He ate macholas asuros min haTorah. According to the Tanakama of this Mishnah, chayav. He is chayav for violating a shvuah. He took an oath that he would not eat, and he ate. Rav Shimon Poteh. Rav Shimon holds that a shvuah could not be chal if he's taking upon himself not to eat nevelos shkotzim v'ramosim because he's already mushba v'yomid mar Sinai. He's enjoined by virtue of the shvur that we all took at our Sinai not to eat nevelos treifos shkotzim v'ramosim. And we have a principle in shvur: ein shvur chalal shvur. You can't pile one shvur on top of another. So therefore, although he's chayav obviously for eating nevelos and treifos, but he's not chayav for violating his shvur. And that's Rabbi Shimon. Now the Gemara addresses the Tanakama of Rabbi Shimon, who claims that you're chayav a shvuas karban for violating your shvua by eating shkotzim v'ramosim amai. How can you say he's chayav mushba v'yomid mi'ar Sinai? Who cannot superimpose a shvua on a shvua, and we already took a shvua at our Sinai that we would not eat nevelos utreifos. And here we have two opinions as to how to explain and justify the Chachamim who say that you're chayav. Rav Shmuel, Rabbi Yochanan, that's one opinion. The Amri, they all agree. The kolel dvarim hamutarim im dvarim asurim. There's a way of technically circumventing the principle of ein shvua chal shvua. If the first shvua was limited in its scope, and the second shvua that applied even to that which was included in the first shvua, but expanded the scope of the isur, then the second shvua will be chal. And for example, let's say a person says, shvua shelo ochal, I won't eat, period. I won't eat kosher meat. I won't eat non-kosher meat. Now, as far as the non-kosher meat is concerned, he's mushba b'yomi bar Sinai. But since he took a shvua that he won't eat kosher meat as well as non-kosher meat, that's called an isur kolel, which means that the scope of the isur that he is taking upon himself via the shvua is greater, more encompassing than the original shvua. The original shvua was limited to nevelas and treifas, but now he took a shvua that he won't eat any meat whatsoever. In such a case, his shvua will be chal, hence he's chayav a korban shvua. Reish Lakish Omar, iya tomotzi ela b'mefaresh chatzi shir al liba d'Rabbanan, Obistam, I'll leave it to Rabbi Akiva. So we'll get to Rabbi Akiva in a minute. Let's just focus on the Rabbanan. The Rabbanan of the opinion that when a person takes a shvua, lo ochal, his kavana is he won't eat a kizayis. Less than a kizayis is not considered achila, and that's not included in his shvua shelo ochal. Now, if he takes a shvua b'mefaresh chatzi shir, and he explicitly takes an oath that he won't eat half of a kizayis, then there's no mushba v'yomed me'ar Sinai on a chatzi shir, because this is Reish Lakish who holds the chatzi shir is mutar min Torah. And if his shvua was that he won't even eat a chatzi shir, and that's called mefaresh, he said explicitly that he won't eat a chatzi shir, because had he not said it explicitly, we would assume that his shvua was not to eat a full shir, a full kizayis. But he explicitly said, I won't eat even a chatzi zayis. In such a case, the Rabbanan hold he's violating a shvua because he was not mushba v'yomi me'ar Sinai on a chatzi zayis. Obistam, and here we turn to Daf Ayin Dalid, v'al libid Rabbi Akiva, the Omer Adam Oser Atzma B'Kolshu. Rabbi Akiva thinks that when a person takes a shvua shelo ochal, he means I won't eat at all, even less than a shir. And if he took that shvua that he won't eat at all, then he includes within it chatzi shir, which he's not mushba v'yomi me'ar Sinai, because Reish Lakish, as we said, holds that chatzi shir is mutar min Torah. Now, let's try to understand what the Gemara wants to prove from this statement of Reish Lakish interpreting the Mishnah in Masechet Shavuos. Reish Lakish holds that a shvua could be chal on a chatzi shir. He's not considered mushba v'yomi me'ar Sinai on a chatzi shir. So the Gemara says that it must be the chatzi shir according to Reish Lakish is mutar. If chatzi shir is aser, even midrabanan, then memela he is mushba v'yomi me'ar Sinai. And the reason for that is because the Torah says lo taser mikol yerucha. We are obligated to oblige and to conform with the requirements of the Rabbanan. The Rabbanan have been authorized by the Torah through a lav of lo tasur, and we are enjoined from violating the D'Rabbanans. And therefore, every D'Rabbanan is mushba v'yomi me'ar Sinai. Therefore, in the case of chatzi shir according to Reish Lakish, although it's only D'Rabbanan, nevertheless he's mushba v'yomi because lo tasur mikol yerucha. How then can Reish Lakish claim that if he takes a shvua on a chatzi shir and avails the treifas, the shvua is chal? He's already mushba v'yomi me'ar Sinai. the only possible way out of this is to assume that according to Reish Lakish, not only is Chatzi Shir mutar min Torah, but it's even mutar midrabanan. The Rabbanan never prohibited Chatzi Shir. So the Gemara says, you know what? From that statement of Reish Lakish, you cannot prove anything conclusively, because v'chitema, I can counter argue, came into Islay heter min Torah, kochayel karban shvua. I would suggest, as a counter argument, that since on a doraisa level there's no isur, therefore there's no mushpa v'yomi marsina. The Gemara now is backtracking on the lo tasur, and the Gemara is now assuming that lo tasur would not generate mushpa v'yomi marsina. And the Ran explains because mushpa v'yomi marsina only applies in a case where it's explicit in the Torah. If it's mefurish in the Torah, then it's mushpa v'yomi marsina. But if it's not spelled out in the Torah, then we don't apply mushpa v'yomi marsina. So that's what the Gemara is holding now, that the reason why Reish Lakish holds that we don't apply mushpa v'yomi marsina and the shvua on a chatzi shir of nevela treif is chal, this despite the fact that the Rabbanan prohibited chatzi shir, because when the Rabbanan prohibit chatzi shir, it does not come under the halach of mushpa v'yomi marsina, because we never took an explicit shvua on the Rabbanan, meaning that which the Rabbanan decided at some point to enact an isur and create an isur, that's not included in mushpa v'yomi marsina. The Gemara says now that position is untenable. Why? Vatnan, we have another Mishnah in Masechet Shvuos. Shvuos ha'edus einen oheges ela b'ru'uyim laha'it. The Mishnah says that if I am involved in a litigation, let's say I'm a plaintiff claiming that you owe me money, you're the defendant, and then I know that there are two gentlemen over here that have testimony that could support my claim when I sue you for money, but they're refusing to give testimony. You know, they just, what are you talking about? We never saw it. We don't have edus. They deny the fact that they have testimony. I know that they have testimony. But, you know, it's always an easy thing not to come to the courts. So what I'm allowed to do, the Torah authorizes me to impose a shvuah on these edim. And I will say, Hareini mashbia alechem shetavo v'taiduni. I am imposing an oath on you to come and testify because you know testimony on my behalf. And the Torah says, once the edim hear the shvuah now is valid, and it obligates them, in the event that they have the edus, to give edus to come forward and testify. They didn't do so. Later, at some point in time, maybe they did tshuva, and they came forward and they admitted, yes, we do have edus. So they violated the shvuah, and the Torah at the beginning of Sefer Vayikra spells out a carbon that they have to bring for having violated that shvuah. However, the Mishnah in Shvuah says it only applies to re'uyim lahayit, to those witnesses that would, if they came to Bezdin, would have been accepted as valid edim, to the exclusion of nashim, ktanim, ukrovim. And all these categories are individuals who technically cannot come and testify. They're excluded, therefore, from this shvuah, because the whole purpose of the shvuah is to get these people into court to testify on behalf of the tovea, on behalf of the plaintiff. But in these cases, since they're anyway disqualified for testimony, then it would be pointless for them to come and testify. So the shvuah is not chal. and therefore they are exempt from a carbon shvuah. Then the Mishnah goes on to say, the Einan Oheges Ela B'Ru'uyim Lahoyt, that this parsha and this chiyuv of Shvuas HaEidus only applies for those who are valid candidates for testimony. Why did the Mishnah have to add that? The Mishnah has already given us an enumerated list of those who are excluded from testimony. What did the Mishnah gain to include Kol She'enam Ru'uyim Lahoyt? And here we have a machlokus between Rav Papa and Rav Achabar Yaakov. Havina be'lemute mai. What did the Mishnah mean to add? The Einan Oheges Ela B'Ru'uyim Lahoyt. Rav Papa Omar lemute melech. Interesting. A king is disqualified for testimony. This is what we call a psul aguf. There's a technical psul in the case of a melech, because it's not appropriate for the king to stand in front of a court and testify. And therefore, we would not allow him to testify in a Jewish court of law. And that's what the Mishnah, according to our Papa, meant to include here when it said that Einan Oheges Ela B'Ru'uyim Lahoyt, and a melech is not Roy Lahoyt, and therefore he's not included in the parsha of Shvuas HaEidus. Rav Achabar Yaakov Amar Le'Me'utei Masechet Yoma. A professional gambler who on a doraisa level has not violated any prohibition of gzela, because gzela, we derive from a pasuk in Shmuel, it says, Vayigzal es hachanis miyad ha-mitzri. The case of gzela of a gazlan is where he puts his hand into your pocket and maybe he threatens you and he takes your money against your will. That's not a gambler. A gambler means he agreed that if the other party loses, he'll take his money, but he didn't take it by force. And therefore, that's like Zela Doraisa. The Rabbanan disqualified a Masechet Bekubia, professional gambler. He has no other trade, no other income, no other business or occupation. He's simply a gambler, and Rabbanan don't trust him. We don't believe that he's telling the truth. He's really a Gazlan. Technically, he's not a Gazlan on a Doraisa level, but Rabbanan, he's considered a Gazlan because of a principle called Asmachta Lo Kanya, which, again, we could spend a lot of time on that. I'll just mention it in passing, that we don't assume that a gambler expects to lose. So if he enters into a card game, for example, then the other person whose money he's going to take if he wins never really had in mind that he would lose. A gambler thinks he's going to win. Okay, well, again, that's for another discussion. So the bottom line is that we have here a case of someone who is Roy Lahoyt. He is qualified on a Torah level. A Masechet Bekubia is not a Gazlan. He's not excluded from testimony, but on a D'Rabbanan level, he's excluded from Eidus. And the Mishnah says that in such a case, he's considered an Eino Roy Lahoyt, and he will not be Chayav a carbon Shvuah. So we see that when the Rabbanan establish an enactment, a din, like for example, in this case, they established that a Masechet Bekubia is Pasuli Eidus, that makes it into a Doraisa. Because the Torah says, Lo Tosu Mikol Shayeruch, you have to recognize that which the Chachamim have instituted. Now, if we flip back to our discussion about Reish Lakish holds the Chatzi Shir is Mutar Min HaTorah. The Gemara is suggesting that Midrabanan it's also. Once it's also Midrabanan, then the Torah has to say that if you take a Shvuah, that it's as if this was an Itzur Doraisa. Why would the Chachamim in the previous Mishnah quoted from Shvuah say that if he took a Shvuah Shelo Ochal and then he ate Nevelos Shefasim and Ramosim Shkasim, and Reish Lakish says he ate a Chatzi Shir, that he's Chayav for the Shvuah? What do you mean he's Chayav for the Shvuah? He's Mushba B'Yomim Har Sinai. Because once the Rabbanan institute the Itzur of Chatzi Shir, then it comes under Mushba B'Yomim Har Sinai. I'll prove it to you. Because a Masechet Bekubia is not considered Roy Lahoyt. Why? Because Rabbanan disqualified him for Eidos. And therefore he's not included in the parsha of Shvuas Karban. It must mean that the Torah itself recognizes and validates whatever the Rabbanan institute. HaMesachik B'Kubya, Midaraisa Mechsei Chazi, on a Torah level, he is qualified to testify. He's not a Gazlan, as we said before. For Rabbanan Hu de Paslu, the Rabbanan considered him a pasul, and nevertheless, lo kach chayle alei shvua. Even though on a deraisa level he is included and qualifies for edus, nevertheless he's outside the purview of carbon edus. Why? The only answer to that question could possibly be that even when the mitzvah, the chiyuv, or the psul is the rabbanon, it's considered like it's doraisa, and therefore the Masechet Yoma, although his psul is only the rabbanon, is considered eino roy lahayit. Now it's interesting because that was Rav Acha Bar Yaakov. Rav Papa was looking for a psul doraisa, and that was the case of a melech. Could be that Rav Papa never accepted the very underlying premise of Rav Acha Bar Yaakov, that once the Rabbanon pasuled, in this case the Masechet Yoma, then he's considered on a deraisa level eino roy lahayit. He's not a candidate for testimony. Maybe Rav Papa didn't. So if you're asking a Kacham Reish Lakish, why not just link up Reish Lakish with Rav Papa? But apparently the Gemara is trying to reconcile Reish Lakish even with Rav Acha Bar Yaakov. We don't want to get into, a narrow strait and assume, well, Reish Lakish holds like Rav Papa. That's not the pathway that we want to travel. But once again, how can you tell me the Reish Lakish is moda? That Chatzi Shir is also mirabanan. If that be the case, then why is the Shvua Chal on a Chatzi Shir when the Torah recognizes that which the Rabbanan prohibited, and that comes on the Mushpa V'Yomi Mar Sinai? How can the Shvua be Chal on a Chatzi Shir Nevela when he's enjoined from eating a Chatzi Shir Mirabanan, which makes it into Lo Sasur, and it's upgraded to a Dorais? So the Gemara says, you know what? Reish Lakish holds that Chatzi Shir is also min Torah. And if you take a Shvua and you want to apply the principle of Mushpa V'Yomi, because your Shvua was on the Velas and Trefos, and therefore Ein Shvua Chal Shvua, you can't pile one Shvua on top of the other, that only applies to a Doraisa. An Isa Doraisa comes under the rule of Mushpa V'Yomi Mar Sinai, my friends, but not an Isa D'Rabbanan, as we said before, because it's not mafurish in the Torah. Mushpa V'Yomi Mar Sinai only applies to that Isa which is explicit in the Torah, not to D'Rabbanan. If that be the case, now you're stuck with the issue of Masechet Yoma. Why is he excluded from Shvuas Karban if on a Doraisa level he's kosherly edus? And the Gemara says, Shiny Hasam, in the Parsha Shvuas Edus, it's different. The Amakra, the Apostle says in the 5th chapter of Vayikra, Im lo yagid, and then it says, V'nosavono. In other words, Im lo yagid. All the emphasis here is the fact that he did not come to testify in Bezdin. That's why he's chayav a carbon shvur. But this case of Masechet Yoma, lav bar hagadu klal. If he came to Bezdin, Bezdin would deny him the rights and the ability to testify. He's not a bar haggadah. Again, on a conceptual, theoretical level, Doraisa is kosherly edus. But once the Rabbanan instituted their takana that we will not allow a Masechet Yoma to testify in a court of law, then he's not roy lahagid. What the Gemara is saying is that when the plaintiff, as we call them, the tovea, demands a edus from someone, it means your edus could help me. As a result of your edus, I can force the other litigant's hand to pay me for that which he owes me. By your not coming to testify, I take a loss. And therefore, I'm going to impose a shvu on you that you know edus and you refuse to give it. But in the case of Masechet Yoma, even if he would have shown up in Beis Din, it's worthless. Beis Din would not give him the microphone. He would not have the option to testify. He's not included in Im Lo Yagid. He's not included in the Avera of withholding Haggadah because he didn't withhold Haggadah because he could not have possibly given the Haggadah. And even though that's only on a practical level, on a theoretical level, he is a Bar Haggadah, it doesn't matter. The Parsha of Shuas Eidus depends on Tachlis, on the fall, on whether or not his Eidus would have been meaningful for me. And if it would not have been meaningful for me because the Rabbanan passled him, he's not included in the Parsha of Shuas Eidus. But again, getting back to our original statement, Enoch Hinami, it's very possible that Rish Lakish would maintain the position that Chatzi Shir is Osir al Kolponim Mirabbanan, at least Mirabbanan it's Osir. You can't eat a half his eyes in the Vela. And when he takes a Shvuah Shalo Ochal, he's not considered Mushba V'Yomim Mar Sinai, despite the fact that the Chatzi Shir is Osir Min Torah, because, as we said, Chatzi Shir is not explicit in the Torah. That which is not explicit in the Torah does not come under Mushba V'Yomim Mar Sinai. We find, by the way, a similar idea with regard to what's called a mecha. Let me explain to you what I mean by a mecha. The law is that if I see a Jew violating the Torah, chas v'shalom, then I have to give him rebuke. And if I can't give him rebuke, at the very least, I have to make a mecha. I have to protest. Doesn't mean that I have to throw stones at his car on Shabbos, but I do have to make a protest and object to the fact that he's violating the Torah. What happens if I see a Jew, Nebuch, who's violating a D'Rabbanan? Am I chayav in mecha? And many Rishonim hold no, because it's not mushba v'yomim mar Sinai. A D'Rabbanan is not explicit in the Torah. It could be, by the way, that when we talk about a mumar, someone who deliberately and consistently violates the Torah and we change his status, that's only if he violates something which is mefurash in the Torah, it's explicit in the Torah. That which is derived by the Rabbanan could be he's not a mumar. We see over and over again that Mushba V'Yomim Mar Sinai applies to that which is explicit in the Torah. And when one violates that which is explicit in the Torah, that's a whole different level. Now, what was the Gemara thinking at the beginning and rejected at the end? We have a whole shakalatariya here about whether or not Rish Lakish could possibly maintain that Chatzi Shir is Osir Rabbanon, but nevertheless it's not Mushba V'Yomim Mar Sinai. The Gemara initially thought that even on a Rabbanon, the Torah says Lo Tosar Mikol Shayarucha, you have to listen and oblige the Rabbanon, therefore it's Mushba V'Yomim Mar Sinai. And the Gemara now rejects it. The Gemara is saying Enoch Hinami, Rish Lakish holds that Chatzi Shir is Osir Rabbanon, but it's not Mushba V'Yomim Mar Sinai. What was the Gemara thinking originally? That he is Mushba V'Yomim Mar Sinai Lo Tasur, and why did the Gemara reject it? What was the issue here, back and forth, between the Makshon and the Maskana the Tarz? I would like to suggest the following interpretation. What is Chatzi Shir on a D'Rabbanan level? Rish Lakish is of the opinion that the Torah only prohibited a Shir, but less than a Shir the Torah would permit it. And the Rabbanan prohibited. what was the nature of that Iser D'Rabbanan in the case of Chatzi Shir? And we can define it in one of two ways. Both, I think, are logically valid. There's Chatzi Shir of Nevela on the table, half a zayis of Nevela. Reish Lakish would prohibit eating it on a D'Rabbanan level. And now we're wondering, is it Mushba V'Yomei Marsid? The man went ahead and he took a shvuah that he would not eat that Chatzi Shir that's on the table. Now we can wonder and offer two different definitions of what is the status of that half a shear, half a zayis' worth of nevela that's on the table. Are you ready for this? Oh yeah, Alan's the only one I can see, but good. Alan said yes, so I'm assuming he's speaking on behalf of the Bryans and the Judys and the Galaxies and 520 and also David. So Alan gave me the go-ahead. Are you ready for this? Yes. Alan said yes. He's mushba v'yomei that he's ready for. This Chatzi Shir of Nevela that's on the table, if Chas v'sholom somebody eats it, is that considered that he ate Nevela? The Torah says Nevela is only a shear of a kezayis. Did the Rabbana now subsume a Chatzi Shir of Nevela into the Torah's definition of Nevela? And how could they do so? Because the Torah invested authority in the Chachamim, lo sasu b'kol sheyeruch. They took a Chatzi Shir of Nevela and made it into Nevela. Or no? A Chatzi Shir, half his eyes of Nevela is not Nevela. You're not allowed to eat it because lo tosu b'kol sheyeruch. If you eat the Chatzi Shir, the half his eyes is Nevela, you are, so to speak, pardon this take it figuratively, you are, so to speak, slapping the Rabbanan in the face. You're saying, I don't care about what the Rabbanan tell me. I am lo sosa, I am sosa b'kol sheyeruch. The eating of the Chatzi Shir is only a particular expression of the fact that I violated and rebelled against the Chachamim. But the Avera here is not the eating of a half Izayas of Nevela, because a half Izayas of Nevela is not Nevela. I am, by virtue of eating the half Izayas of Nevela, rebelling against the Chachamim. In the first definition, the Rabbanan declared that a Chatzi Shir of Nevela is Nevela. In the second definition, Chatzi Shir Nevela is not Nevela. Now, to give it a little bit of a brisker terminology, the first definition is what we call an Iser Chefza. The second definition is what we call an Iser Gav. Gemara at the beginning of Nidarim, in explaining the difference between a neder and a shvuah, establishes that a neder is an iser cheft, a shvuah is an iser gav. What is Chatzi Shir? Is it an iser chefta or is it an iser gav? What do I mean? If it's an iser chefta, then what I'm saying is the Rabbanan considered this a cheft of nevela, even though it's a Chatzi Shir. The Lotasser gives the Chachamim the authority to establish that a Chatzi Shir is Nevela. And that's an Iser Chefta. On an Iser Chefta, you cannot add a Shvuah. You can't say, well, I want to take a Shvuah not to eat a Chatzi Zayis in Nevela. You have a Chefta D'Isura. And the Shvuah cannot be Chal now because it's already also B'Tor's Chefta. Or no? When the Rabbanan institute the Isur of Chatzi Shir, they're not saying that this is a Chefza D'Isura, it's a half a Zayas. It can never be a Chefza D'Isura. It's an Isur Gav. You're not allowed to eat it. Because if you do so, you are demonstrating your rebellion against the Chacham. If that be the case, then the Chefza per se is Heter. And therefore, the Shvuah on this half a Zayas of the Vela is valid because it's not a Shvuah piled up on a Shvuah. You're not adding an Isur onto a Chefza because there was no Chefza d'Isura. The entire Isur from A to Z, from soup to nuts, was an Isur Gavna, not an Isur. Okay, let's go on in the Gemara. Now, just to introduce the next piece of Gemara, let's review what we saw at the beginning of this parak, the beginning of this limud on Ayin Gimel and Beis. The Gemara was bothered by the fact that the Mishnah says that Yom Kippurim is asur, b'achila u'shasiya, etc., implying that there's no chiyuv kares. And if the Mishnah would have held that if you eat on Yom Kippur Chayiv Kares, it would not have used the language of Asur, it would have said Chayiv Kares. And based on that question, Reish Lakish derived the conclusion that the Mishnah is talking about an achil of Chatzi Shir, and Chatzi Shir is mutar min Torah. Hence, there cannot be an Isur Kares, an Onish Kares in the case of Chatzi Shir. That's why the Mishnah meticulously employed the term Asur and not Chayav. Gemara is not happy. V'chol heicha, the Onish Kares, lo tani Asur. The underlying premise of the Gemara's question that when it says Asur, it means that there's no chiyuv karetz. Is that really so? For Astanya, we have a brisa, and the brisa seems to indicate that it's not so, and that the language asur could apply even in a case of a chiyuv karetz. The brisa says afal pisha amru asur bekulam. The Mishnah uses the term asur referring to 5 categories of inui, and one might think mistakenly that all 5 are equal on the same level, and there's a chiyuv kares in all 5. Lo amru anush kares ela al ha'ochel v'shose v'ose malacha bilvad. Of the 5 inuyim, only achila and shasiya generate kares. The other categories, like Nilas Asandal and Tashamita and Rechitza and Sicha, they don't generate kares. And even though the word Asur in our Mishnah is kolel, it includes all the cases, all the categories of an Inui. Nevertheless, says the Brisa, that's not what the Mishnah meant, to say that they're all equal. They were all lumped together under the word Asur, but only with regard to Achila and Shasiya is there an Onish Kares. But as far as the balance, the other Inuyim is concerned, there is no Onish Kares. In any event, we see clearly from this brisa that the word Asur in our Mishnah, which applies even to Achila and Shasiya, includes within it an indication that we're talking about a chiyuv karetz. The brisa is only telling you that don't think that because there's an isur karetz in the case of achil and shasiya, therefore mistakenly, make the equation and assume that all the other afflictions, all the other inuyim are also included in the chiyuv karetz. No, the word asur here in our Mishnah means 2 things. With regard to Achil and Shasiya, what's the taich? What's the meaning of the word Asur? It means a chiyuv kares. With regard to the other Isurim included under this Isur, which are delineated in the Mishnah, there the Mishnah means it's also without a chiyuv kares. But clearly the word also, insofar as that relates to achil and shasiya, indicates a chiyuv kares. So why does the Gemara asks, and it's up in arms, well, how could the Mishnah say asur and not chayav when we're talking about a chiyuv kares? So the Gemara answers, Hachi Kamar. Here's what the Brisa has in mind. Kisha Amru, when the Mishnah says, as far as the Inuyim of Yom Kippurim, asur in inverted commas, which means that it doesn't have a chiyuv kares, lo amru ella be-chatzi shir. If he ate a chatzi shir, that's when, according to the Brisa interpretation, the word asur means an Isser without kares. Aval kishir, but the Brisa is telling you something which is not mentioned in the Mishnah, that if you ate a full shir, a koseves worth of achila shasiya, then you would be chayiv kares. But that's not the asur in our Mishnah, because the asur in our Mishnah is addressing a case of chatzi shir. The afal pi sha'onish kares, in a case where there is a shir is chayiv kares, ein onish kares ella ha'ochel v'shosa v'osa malacha bilvad. The Brisa is adding that in a case where he was guilty of a full shir, he will be chayiv kares, but only vis-a-vis achila and shasiya, not with regard to the other inuyim. The other inuyim would not generate an onish kares in any situation, in any scenario whatsoever, even if he was guilty for a full shir. Now, at this point, I feel compelled to introduce a major machlokes rishonim, a great, great debate. And this controversy splits the rishonim into two camps. According to one group of rishonim, in the cases of rechitza, sicha, etc., the other inuyim, you're not chayiv kares, but you definitely violate an isur doraisa. And another group of rishonim say that we're not just excluding the other inuyim, rechitza, etc., from kares. What we're saying is that they are dirabana. The whole entity of inuyim minus achil and shasiya is all dirabana, according to that sheet in rishonim. And even though we're going to see in our perek that we're going to derive all those categories of inui from psukim, those psukim are what we call asmachta, that's not a dorais. Now, I'll read to you a few lines here in a footnote in my Gemara. It says, Miloshan habraisa, ochichu aran vasmag, she'af shar isurim, milvad achila shasiya, asurim midaraisa, ela she'en bohem chiyuv kares, she'im lo haya bohem at le'isa drabanan, lo haya shayach halashon, lo amru anush kares, ela b'achila shasiya. The implication of the Gemara is that as far as the chiyuv kares is concerned, that's where we're limited to achila and shasiya. But as far as the other isurim are concerned, they are doraisa, but nevertheless, there's no chiyuv kares. So that's the shita that's headed up by the Ran and the Sma. However, as we'll soon see, other Rishonim are of the opinion that the other inuyim are only derabban. And this, my friends, has tremendous repercussions in terms of psak halacha and under what circumstance we can be mekil with regard to rechitza and sicha, especially for a woman after birth that we touched upon in our Mishnah, and so forth and so. The Gemara now suggests an ibois emo. We were of the opinion that the word osur in our Mishnah was a misplaced word. It should have said onish kares. And the Gemara said that we're talking about a case of a chatzi shir. Says the Gemara, I have alternative suggestion. Ibois emo. I could answer that ki ktari osur ashara, that the word osur here in our Mishnah is not referring to achil and shasiya, but rather it's referring to the other inuyim like rechitz and sicha, etc. And they don't have an isur kares. So if you're asking me why it says osur and not chiv kares, it's because we're referring to rechitz and sicha, and there's no chiv kares and achila in rechitz and sicha. So therefore, you don't have to introduce chatzi shir into our Mishnah. Forget about chatzi shir. The reason why the Mishnah employs the terminology asur as opposed to chiv kares is because the Mishnah is addressing rechitza, sicha, tashrush, hamita, nilas, hasandal, all of which do not incur a chiv kares. And Rav Yosef, Bishar Sifrei Debei Rav and Rav Yosef teach us from the Braisos of Rav, Minayin liyom HaKippurim sha'osur berechitza v'sicha v'nil sasan v'tashamita Talmud lomar shvos. When the Torah says v'nisem es nafsho seichem, it's not referring to any of the other isurim, the other inuyim. It's only referring to achila and shasiya. However, the pasuk says regarding Yom Kippur, Shabbos Shabboson hilachem. Why does the Torah add the extra word Shabboson? And the answer is to indicate that we have to add other inuyim in addition to achil and shasiya. So the achil and shasiya, they are included in the chiyuv kares, and the balance of the surah inui are derived from the pasuk Shabboson Shvos, but they would not generate a chiyuv kares. And in fact, harishonim nechlaku b'shari nuyim im asurim midoraisa lo, as we indicated earlier. Tosus kosu b'shem Rabbeinu Tam shekol sharei nuyim enam asurim ela midrabana. So we had earlier the Smag and the Ran, who maintained that all inuyim are doraisa, just that the other inuyim other than achil shasi have no chiv kares. Now we have the Shita Rabbeinu Tam, that all inuyim other than achil shasi are only derabana. Vadrashos me'apsukim, and we're going to see the Gemara is going to darshan from psukim all the other inuyim enom ela smacht. V'olchacha mihad demuvur bebraisa shemisha yemaluchlach betit ubitsoa rochetz kedarko v'yedo choshesh. If a person has filth attached to his body, on Yom Kippur, he's allowed to wash the filth off his body. V'chein, misha yesh lo chatotin b'rocho, his head is swamped with bugs, let's say. Then he's allowed to do sicha on his head. Says Rabbeinu Tam, in rechitza v'sicha v'asurim doraisa, if the Ran and the Smag were correct that these isurim are biblical, lo hayu matirim zos. We're not talking about a sakana, a person whose life is in danger. Why are we going to be lenient in rechitza for the sake of someone who has filth on his body, or sicha in the case of mishi yesh lo chatotin berosha? So this is the Shita of Rabbeinu Tam, and apparently other Rishonim agree with Rabbeinu Tam. Ulam, however, Hamran, Kosav shekol hainuyim asurim midoraisa, and that's what the Brisa means when it says Afal picha omru asu bekulam lo omru onush kares ela ala ochel v'shosa, etc. bilvad. If there was only an Isa Drabanan, then the language of Lo Omru Onish Kares would not be applicable because there's not even an Isa Doraisa. It must be that there's an Isa Doraisa, but then you have to ask Rabbeinu Tam's question, how we were lenient in all those cases that we mentioned before of Meluchach Betit or Chatot Berocho. Says the Ran, Hitiru Chachamim Be'ofanim Misuyamim Shemi'acher V'ein Ha'inuyim Elu Mefurashim B'Kasu El Chachamim Lamdu Osam Miriboy HaPosuk Shabboson Lefichach Dinam Kal Yosef V'Akasav Mosron LeChachamim V'Hem Ikilu Behem Lefi Masharo Lahach. Wow. Amazing Ran. The Ran says that since the other Inuyim are not explicit in the Torah, the Chachamim derive it from the extra word Shabbaton. It means that the Torah authorized the Chachamim to decide when and under what circumstances these expanded Inuyim apply. And the Rabbanan said, you know what? If it's a rechitza for the purpose of tainug, he wants to enjoy a hot bath, that's prohibited on Yom Kippur. But if, on the other hand, he's washing away filth that's stuck to his body, got cement on his body, that's not called rechitza shel tainug, and the Rabbanan say that it's mutter. But if it would be a rechitza shel tainug, then it's awesome in Torah. That's the Ranshi. And I'll give you another wonderful example of this with regard to Malacha and Chol HaMoed. The Torah says about Chol HaMoed, Mikrai Kodesh. It doesn't say exactly what's prohibited and what's not on Chol HaMoed. And the Ritva is famous for saying that the Torah was particularly ambiguous about Mikrai Kodesh, about Chol HaMoed. And the Torah basically is saying that this is a day that you have to call Kodesh. What do you mean you have to call it Kodesh? What are they going to call it Berzon on the phone and say, Berzon, call it Kodesh? It means that the Torah is mandating the Chachamim to carve out and design how to create Mikrai Kodesh, such that Chol HaMoed is a day of Kedusha. And the Rabbanan are now authorized by the Torah to define Mikrai Kodesh. When does Mikrai Kodesh apply? When does it not apply? What pa'ulos, what actions will violate the Kedusha of Chol HaMoed and what will not? And as you know, I have a whole book here on Chol HaMoed, and there are 5 categories in which the Rabbanan allowed Malacha on Chol HaMoed. So, for example, you have Tzorchei Hamon. And the Rabbanan wanted to design Chol HaMoed in such a way that it would allow a person to have oneg, and that's called Tzorchei Hamon. So for the benefit of Moed, if I, for example, let's say I wanted to acquire food for a nice Chol HaMoed meal, and doing so would involve a malacha, so the Rabbanan would say that I'm allowed to do it l'tzorchei hamon. Okay then? So we have this new halachic category of prohibitions where the Torah was deliberately ambiguous and authorized the Chachamim to define the scope of that Isur, when it applies and when it doesn't apply. And this is the way the Ran understands the Shabboson of Shar Inuyim, the other Inuyim that are listed in our Mishnah. Ufa, let's go on in the Gemara. Chatzi Shir Rabbi Yochanan Omar Asum in Torah. Reish Lakish Omar Mutam in Torah. Rabbi Yochanan Omar Asum in Torah came to Chazi Litztarufe Isura Ka'achil. The Torah is basically telling you that every single molecule, if I could use that word, of nevela is nevela. But the Torah says you're only chayav for achila. And achila is only considered achila chashuv if you eat a kezayis. But the nevela that the Torah prohibited includes even a chatzi shir. That's called chazi l'tztarufe. If he takes a half of a zayis of nevela, he can add another half of a zayis to the nevela. If he takes a quarter of a zayis to the nevela, he can add another quarter and another quarter, 4 quarters, make a whole. That's called chazi l'tztarufe. It's roy. It fits to add together and accumulate shear. So every single particle and every segment is nevela, and it's also min haTorah. Reish Lakish min haTorah achila omar achmanav aleko. The Torah doesn't say that you shouldn't eat nevela, in the sense that this molecule, this piece of a quarter of a zayis is nevela. The Torah says don't eat nevela, and achila requires a share of kezayis. Ein achila pachos mikezayis. Esvei Rabbi Yochanan l'Reish Lakish. Let's take a look at the parsha of chelev. Chelev are certain parts of a behemoth, certain fats of a behemoth. Again, today, we're not exactly sure, where these fats are, so we're very machmir, but in the old days, they were able to identify exactly which chelev of the behemoth is us. Now, we have another category of animals, some of which are kosher, not too many, which is called a chaya. For example, a deer, which in meat terms is called venison. Again, if I could see your faces, I would ask the question, how many people here ever ate venison in their life? I ate it once in my life. And there's a very, very expensive...
Never.
There's a very expensive restaurant in Manhattan. Again, I don't know if it still exists. La Marais, it's called, that French name. And you can buy venison. A piece of venison this size will cost you, well, then it was $70. Today it'd probably be $170. I wasn't paying the bill, mind you. Otherwise, no way I could have afforded it. But I had a Talmud who was paying the bill, and honestly, I didn't tell him because I didn't enjoy it at all. Very tough. I'll just give me a good rib steak. I don't, I'm not a vegetarian or any of that stuff. That's not a bird's eye. But I don't need venison. Anyway, venison is deer, and it is a chaya. The Torah permits eating the chelev of a chaya. The Torah prohibits eating the chelev of a behemoth. Okay. Now we have a brisa that says, "Ein li ela kol sheyeshno ba'onesh yeshno bazhara." I tried to mute you because it's really bothering my ear. So if somebody here could mute their microphone. Anyway, "Ein li ela kol sheyeshno ba'onesh kares yeshno bazhara." Only if you eat the chelev of a behemoth are you included in the isur. But if it's not an onish kares, then it's not included in the isur, in the azhara. If that be the case, says the brisa, koi, we'll get back to koi in a minute, or v'chatzi shir, hol v'eno ba'onesh kares, is Yachol Eino Bazhar, Tamalomar Kol Chelev. Let's go back to the pasuk. The pasuk in Vayikra Perek Zayin says Kol Chelev Shar v'Kesev v'Eiz Lo Sochelu, and Ki Kol Ochel Chelev Min Behema v'Nichras HaNefesh Ochels Me'ameha. And there's an extra word in the pasuk, and that's Kol Chelev. As a result of the extra word kol chelev, the brisa derives chatzi shir. clearly Chatzi Shir is awesome in a Torah. And the language of the Brisa is very clear. It says, Yeshno Bazhara. And for Reish Lakish, Mirabanan Ukra Smachta Bi'alma. The Brisa didn't mean to say that on a Doraisa level, you violated Nazhara by eating a Chatzi Shir of Chelev. All the Brisa meant to say was, it's awesome in Rabbanan. And the pasuk is an asmach. That's how Reish Lakish defends us. And just to end cheer for tonight, Hochinami Mistabra, the Isa Kedai to Do Raisa, is Kai Sveikahu, the Itzra Krol Asuye Sveika. All right, so then we have to get into a whole discussion about what Kai is, but I think it's late for now, and we'll have to wait till after Matan Torah. I'll see you, Mitzvah Shem, next Wednesday, and we'll talk about my favorite Kai. Thank you very much. And
Good night, Rabbi. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Chag Sameach, everybody. Shabbat
Chag
Shalom.
Sameach to everybody.
Ron, what happened to you?